my name is Sam. This is my colleague Sharan, and we work at a company called The Ready. And The Ready is an org change and transformation consultancy. We help often very large organizations think about and actually adopt new ways of working. So we try to bring often pretty traditional organizations into the future of work. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that today, and more importantly, as much as I would love to stand up here and talk for 45 minutes, that's really my wheelhouse. We're not going to do that. We're going to talk for like 5 minutes, and then we're going to actually do something together. So let's jump into it right away and move on. So this is an org chart. Probably looks familiar. You probably have seen some org charts in your day. My question to you is, what year is this org chart from? Just call out some years. This year, 2017, what else? 1898. We have some incredible spread here. We are over 100 years. The actual answer is 1910. This is a railroad company org chart. And the interesting thing is not necessarily that it's old. The interesting thing is that nobody in this room could really pinpoint the specific year or even the era that this came from. If I showed you a shoe or a car or maybe a piece of clothing from 1910, you'd be like, yeah, that's super old, I can tell. But one of the most fundamental tools that we use for thinking about organizations and visualizing organizations has not changed in well over 100 years. And that's not necessarily bad, but it is interesting and it should get us thinking. Second quiz. This is probably a little small for everyone to see, so I'm going to read these out to you and think about if you ever experience these behaviors at work. Insist on doing everything through channels. When possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Haggle over precise wordings of communications, minutes, and resolutions. Refer back to matters decided upon at the last meeting and then attempt to reopen the question of the advisability of that decision. Advocate caution. And then finally, see that 3 people have to approve everything where 1 would do. Any of this sound familiar? Probably not in your company, but other companies, right? Okay. So these are interesting. Well, where did these phrases come from, these ideas? This came from a handbook written by the CIA during World War II. And it was a handbook designed specifically around how do employees or people who work at German factories who are who support the Allied cause, what can they do to potentially sabotage their German companies? These were the ideas that were in the handbook. These types of things that have just kind of become how we work now. And that should be profoundly troubling to anybody who cares about organizations and how they work. So what we're living in is kind of the shadow of the industrial era. The guy on the right there, Frederick Winslow Taylor, came up with this idea of scientific management. And the basic tenet of it is separating the thinking and the doing. So you have the managers who design all of the work, and then the doers who actually do the work. And what that has kind of resulted in is an operating system or a belief that organizations are just like machines. And if you pull the right levers, then you can optimize for whatever it is that you want to optimize for. And we would argue that although this did work for a really long time, a lot of material wealth came out of it, maybe not so great on the worker side of things, it's not working as well anymore. So these two charts both show some evidence to that. So on the left here, we have the rates of return on assets of U.S. firms from 1965 to 2015, going from the upper left to the bottom right. Basically, it's becoming harder to earn returns on assets. And then on the right here, we have the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500, ranging from in 1958 to about 65 or so, to drastically lower now, less than 20. Both of these things should make us think, well, what is it about the way organizations are run nowadays that is causing it to be more difficult to be successful, causing it's more difficult to even exist nowadays. So you've heard me use this phrase, operating system. That's kind of the foundational metaphor that we use at The Ready for thinking about organizations. Like your phone or your computer, an organization also has an operating system. And like your phone or your computer, you don't necessarily think about it a lot. It's actually mostly invisible. But everything you can see, everything you interact with, rides on top of this operating system. So what you see here is what we call the OS canvas. And it has just 12 fields that describe parts of an organization. And within these fields are the behaviors, the principles, the heuristics, the rules about how we think about these things or how we do these things. So I'm not going to go through every single field, but you see things on here like meetings. So how do we think about meetings at our company? How do we actually have meetings? Are they quick and snappy, or are they really long and everybody spends all day in meetings? Structure, what's our org structure like, but also what's our physical structure like? What's our office space like? And this is a very value neutral tool. You can put lots of great things in there, you can put a lot of bad things in there, and we're actually going to spend some time talking about that next.
Awesome. So if we know then, can you hear me now? Thanks. So if we know then that the old OS, or that an operating system that we're currently using a lot in our organizations is based on these older assumptions that, some people are fit to be the thinkers and others are the doers, and it was based on these principles of scientific management. It's not working anymore. What should our new OS look like? What is like that upgrade feature that we're looking for? And what should we be thinking about as an OS that will be ready for the future of work? So there's two core principles in the new OS that is ready for the future of work. The first is that they are people positive. So the new organizations assume and expect the best of everyone because they fundamentally believe that people innately have a desire to fulfill their potential and that everybody has the capacity to be creative. So if people are showing up, or you're thinking that they're lazy or incompetent or just not quite creative enough, it's because they're showing up the way the system around them expects them to show up. Maybe they're lazy because we spend so much time micromanaging or delegating very meaningless tasks to people. Maybe they're not creative because they spend their whole day in meetings where they never get asked a question or given the space to think creatively, and instead are listening to a few people talk at them all the time. So a people positive OS is basically saying all the 12 fields that Sam had up on the slide earlier should be oriented around this belief that people are going to we assume the best of people. And so these OSs will say, well, let's give people autonomy, because when we give autonomy, people will actually accept responsibility. And if we actually trust people, they will do the right thing. So some of the practices that we're seeing is like giving autonomy to teams that are serving the customer, making sure those teams that are on the front lines working with the customers and made up with people of diverse skills and experiences, and saying you have full autonomy to do what you need to satisfy your customer and manage your finances, and we are going to trust you to serve them well, rather than worrying about if there's an exception and reporting up the management chain and getting approval, meanwhile the customer is unhappy. The other key principle of future OS, future-ready OSs, is that they're complexity conscious. So despite the title of this session, it was a bit of like clickbait to get people here. A complexity conscious OS recognizes that you actually cannot control an organization. You cannot fix it. It is a complex system that is full of surprises and interactions that we cannot wrap our hands around. And in that sense, it can't be controlled. It can only be nudged. Culture emerges and we have to cultivate it. And with that, performance, or how a company performs, is less the result of the best budget or the most meticulous plan or making sure you developed the best rules to make sure your employees behaved a certain way, but instead your performance is really a result of the collective intelligence in the room, your ability to let that emerge and facilitate interaction, and that the people are going to self-regulate and use their judgment. So complexity conscious organizations really believe that we just need to create the right conditions for people and have a few enabling constraints so that people can use their judgment and exercise freedom to interact with each other to figure something out. So another practice we see that's quite common is moving away from the annual plan, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. That's like an elaborate show at a company, right? There's like many meetings. We have to review the budget, get it all precise. What if instead you met every quarter and you just had a few simple rules or statements that would help employees think about their behavior? So something I've seen recently with a client is enhancing existing capabilities even over developing new ones. Simple sentence, not elaborate, but it's so clear and it will let people, regardless of their job, know what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. But these are radical shifts we're talking about. And when I say radical, I don't mean like crazy and out of left field. I mean at the root, it is a fundamental shift in the way people think. And so here, this is a picture of how most people did the high jump before 1968. It was face forward. And it was just seen, well, the pole is in front of me, I got to go over it forward. Until 1968, when Dick Fosbury entered, and he won the gold medal in the Olympics in 1968 by going over it backwards. And that's kind of symbolic of the shift we're experiencing now that organizations have to make, right? We're so used to thinking we have to go over it forwards and that there can't possibly be another way until it takes a brave, creative person to do it backwards. And now this is the norm of how everybody jumps over the high jump. So even though we think it's counterintuitive, the shift that we're asking companies to make is uncomfortable. And that discomfort or that awkwardness doesn't mean it's bad. It probably means you're leaning into the right things. And we just are putting this out here to say that oftentimes when we're up against trying to drive change in organizations, people are uncomfortable, and we see that as a sign of like, this can't be the right way, or it's not going to work. And actually with Dick Fosbury, a lot of people at that time said, that's great, it's going to work for him, but it's not going to work for me. And we hear that a lot with organizations, right? People positive, complexity conscious, that's good for the tech firms. That's good for, people out in California, but it can't work for us. And so it's just helpful to remember that any shift that we're talking about like this is going to be uncomfortable, and that doesn't mean it's bad. So how do we actually create this shift? And that's some of what we're going to get you all practicing today. Again, when we think about change, it goes to this place of a change plan with multi-steps and stakeholders, but ironically, that's not very people positive or complexity conscious. And so really what we need to be doing instead is building capacity for teams to be doing change loops, to be sensing what's not working and owning that, let's have a talk about our team and how are we working? Is it working for us? What's not? So it's sensing tensions, thinking about new practices that they could try. So for example, if you notice that trust is kind of low on the team, what are some ways that we could alleviate that? Maybe we should open up our calendars. Maybe we open the doors at our office. Maybe we should start using Slack. And then you start experimenting. You just pick the one thing that you want to try and start doing it immediately. So if you're saying, well, Slack, we'd have to get massive approval, it's not going to be that easy, great. Maybe don't try that right away. Let's try opening up our calendars and seeing what happens. And so it's through this continuous loop of experimentation and experimenting and sensing our way to this new way of working that we're really trying to build capacity for in organizations, rather than this desired end state that everyone's moving towards. Because if teams know how to do this, and as long as they can sense their own issues and come up with experiments that they want to try, they're going to be ready for the future of work because they have internalized how to be adaptive. So we have a task for you all today where we wanted you to get into this experience together in groups. We have some OS canvases up across. We have like 3 here, and we have a few back in this room over here. So after I finish explaining, we're going to ask you to kind of self-organize into groups of 10 to 15 by an OS canvas. Next to the canvas, there are 2 stacks of cards. One stack is, thanks Sam, is a list of tensions. So we've created kind of like this card deck of tensions that are common in organizations. We want each of you to pick one that's like really juicy for you right now, that you're feeling in your organization or maybe with a client that you're working with. Then we want you to, also there's blank cards, so if you want to write into one that's not there, you can do that. Then we want you to think about where on the operating system, where is that tension coming from? So the canvases are a little bit small compared to the tensions, so there's also Sharpies. You can just kind of write in where you think it goes. But do kind of that exercise of, I have this tension, like where might it be coming from in the organization? Is it because of meetings? Is it because of how we communicate? Is it because of planning? Then the second deck of cards are tactics. So the second part of that loop is looking at different practices or tactics you can try. The tactics are taken from lots of research around what are people positive and complexity conscious things we can start doing immediately and that we often do with our clients. So we're going to ask you to then pick a tactic from that deck that you feel will address your tension. If you started trying it immediately and did it for a month, do you think it might help nudge and move some of the tension that you're feeling? Similarly with that, think about where on the canvas that tactic fits. And we want you to be having a conversation with each other, right? Because you're in groups. So talk with each other about where you're placing things and why, what you're seeing and noticing. We also have a little handout for you guys with questions that you can be answering together. And then we're going to ask you to come back here to full group so that we can hear what you've learned from your discussion before we close.
Yeah, so we started a little bit late. So it's 3:15 right now. Go away, Siri. 3:15 right now. Why don't we do this until 3:30?
Yeah.
And then we'll ask you to come back here and we'll have just a quick closing conversation at 3:30.
Cool.
So find a canvas, find a friend or a few, and find your tensions and tactics.
Cool.
And come to us if you have questions.
We'll be circling.
We're gonna be walking around. There's a bunch more on the other side as well.
Okay, so switch off the mics and then just switch them on again when you want to go into it. So that's going out to the live stream as well as the
Yeah, mine was green when
All right. For those of you who have headphones on or are watching live stream, you've just heard my voice. I am saying things. All right. So we just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the experience that you all just had here to give you a little bit of more context as to how we do this activity. You just did it in 15 minutes. When we do it with a team for real, it's like a 2-hour thing. Like, we really kind of luxuriate in it. We made you just do it really fast. So you just got the tiniest taste. But my first question for everyone, and we'll run a mic to you so that we can all hear you. Just, what did you notice? What did you notice, or what did you learn just from doing that activity? And we'll run a mic to you if you have a thought. Yeah, back corner there.
I think that what we learned is that we all work at the same company, but then we had one person join us that doesn't. Similar problems across organizations, which is not surprising, but always sort of refreshing. And then, some of the tactics were things that we've tried, but maybe we're too quick to abandon when we just didn't see the nudge, fast enough, because we were looking for transformational change when we should be looking for, according to you guys, the nudge in the culture.
Yeah, that's great. That really resonates with our experience of working with clients across lots of different industries. Everybody thinks they're broken in unique ways. Actually, most organizations are kind of broken in very similar ways. So you guys discovered that as well. What else? Who else noticed something or learned something?
So what we were doing was we obviously kind of just decided to kind of pick the ones that all of us were from different companies. But what ended up happening was a lot of the tensions were very tactical in that sense. So what ended up, I don't know if this grid is organized in any hierarchy, but it seemed like all the strategic or all the things on top were kind of empty, at least within the group that we were. But we wondered if that's something that is something mostly when you're actually doing the work versus an executive or leadership kind of has a very different perspective to the challenges. So you end up kind of, if you do this across various levels of the organization, you'll weed out a lot more of the challenges. So it's important to do it along a spectrum and not only with the executive team or et cetera, right? So
yeah, totally. When we do this work, it's across every level that we can. And we often say we come in at the top and then try to go to the bottom as quickly as possible, but it's from both ends. And our experience as well has been usually the work starts with the really tactical stuff, because the tactical stuff is easy to get your mind around. It's easy to do something different. And once you start doing tactical stuff different, it can unlock really interesting strategic things. Any other just observations or reactions to the activity?
What about where the tensions lived, where the tactics mostly lived for you all? Was it similar across your group, or was there any interesting debate that came out there?
I think that it was hard to know where things might live because, a lot of these problems in the tension area are systemic. And so how someone might experience them is vastly different. We could all agree on the tensions, but I think there was more of a where to put this conversation, which means that there was probably misalignment on what those things meant for our organization in their entirety.
Sure. That conversation is the important thing. It's less about where it ultimately ends up, but how do we make sense of where this tension is coming from? That's really key.
Just to tag onto that, we also found that some of the tensions could live in multiple places, and we chose one place to put them, but most of them could be in many of the different boxes.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's not a me-see framework, unlike a lot of consultants it's more about what are the different ways it can show up, and when we think about that, there's more for us to play with in a way from a tactical standpoint.
I think for our group, we saw a lot of things clustered around the authority box.
Yeah.
And for me, it's interesting because of the context that we're in a lot of our organizations, where a lot of the formal structures and the way we make decisions and the power dynamics are in the same way, or operate in the same way that they always have. However, just work and the way we work and where we work and how we think about teams is changing, and I think this tension between kind of old structures and new ways of work is coming together in the ways we see what the tensions are and what the tactics are to solve them around authority.
Yeah, authority is always one of the main ones.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up to that one. So if with the tensions and authority, what kind of tactics was your group talking about to address some of those?
I'd have to look at our box, which is currently folded.
We thought we should push decision-making authority to the edge. I just remember it said the edge, so that's why I remember that one. But more distributing of decision-making power, which is hard to do when you have, again, the old structures, which are very hierarchical, but trying to basically spread the wealth. Yeah.
Great. So one last question that I have for everyone, and then we'll release you to your delayed coffee break. Can you think of any other interesting ways to potentially use this tool? This was one way. We essentially had you think of your tensions and map them onto the canvas, but it's a very flexible tool. So any other ideas about what you could do with this?
We've been using it, I've been using it with teams as we think about how teams engage in sort of what they're doing now versus what they can do in the future. So it's just a way to help them sort of organize their thinking around what they actually do on a day-to-day basis. So it's been helpful that way.
Cool. Yeah, I've seen teams make a really big one, put it on the wall, and then kind of treat it like a suggestion box. Like when people notice things about their operating system, writing it on a Post-it, putting it on the canvas, and then regularly coming back to that and talking about it as a team. Any other creative ideas about how you could take the OS canvas back to your organization?
So one of the interesting projects that we're working on is helping onboard employees after a merger. And to me, a lot of these boxes seem to communicate, they're almost like things that you should communicate to employees. So
Totally.
It's good to group information in these boxes and say, this is how we do stuff. And so it helps to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. And then right behind you there.
Okay, cool. I was just going to add, we have our employee Git book organized by the 12 fields. So it's a good idea.
I was just going to say, make sure that you're answering all these questions so everyone knows that you're on the same page within the organization.
Yeah, that's great. One other one that I was going to share. So what we had with you today was we gave you a bunch of tensions to kind of help you think through what you might be experiencing. But another way to do it is just take the blank canvas, get in a room with your team, and take it field by field. So when it comes to our structure, what do we like? What do we not like? When it comes to authority, what do we like? What do we not like? And using it to generate that type of conversation.
Yeah, and this is I think of it as the people positive, complexity conscious version of a culture survey, right? Because you can do this at the team level. You don't have something coming to you which is telling you it's anonymous and you have to go through this whole process of filling it out and then waiting for the results. It's in a few hours you can just have a conversation with your team about what's really up for you all right now and develop some approaches that you might want to try and come back to it in a month, in 2 months. It's like a constantly evolving process and a tool that you can keep using in that journey.
Yep, and if you haven't noticed, you should have one of these canvases in your bag. Everybody should have one. If you need another one, just come up and talk to us. We have a few extras. And I think that's it. If you want to talk to us more about the OS Canvas or any of the work that we do, we're at theready.com, Sam and Sharan at theready.com. And thank you very much for your engagement with us.